Well, good morning. First thing today, I want to extend special wishes to all the mothers among us this morning. This is your special day, and I hope it turns out to be a great day for each one of you. The subject of our show this morning is a very serious one. Suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the United States for all ages. Every day, approximately 123 Americans die by suicide. That's one death every 12 minutes. Suicide takes the lives of over 44,000 Americans every year. There are people working to reduce those numbers, including our guest this morning. We'll begin that conversation right now.
From TV6, this is The Ryan Report. Here's your host, Don Ryan.
In 2001, Henry Ford Behavioral Health was the first to pioneer zero suicides as a goal. This landmark approach led to zero suicides for 18 months in 2009 and 10, and a statistically relevant decrease in suicide rates within Henry Ford from its inception. In the years following, a worldwide zero suicide movement has emerged as mental health organizations and governments across the globe have embraced the idea. Our guest this morning has hands-on experience with this approach. Dr. Brian Amadani serves at Henry Ford Health System as Director of Center for Health Policy and Health Services Research and Director of Research Behavioral Health Services. Dr. Amadani, welcome to the Ryan Report.
Oh, thank you for having
me. It took a few minutes to get those titles.
A lot of titles.
It's very nice to have you with us.
Thank you.
Before we get down to our subject this morning, I always like to have our audience get a chance to know our guest a little bit. I don't really know, but looking at your education, it appears you may have grown up in Michigan. Is that
I did. I have grown up in Michigan. I've lived across the Lower Peninsula. Okay. I grew up in the Grand Rapids area, slowly moved across the state to Lansing, and now I live outside of Detroit and work in Detroit.
And all of your education was here in Michigan.
That's right. Michigan State University for graduate school, and I went to Aquinas College in Grand Rapids for undergrad.
At what point did you kind of decide you might want to be a psychologist?
Well, during my master's degree, I was working on some different research projects, and I always wanted to be a therapist, work with people. And, I actually got involved in a research project, fell in love with it, and then, went on to do a PhD and just, took off from there. I just fell in love with doing research and had this unique blend with clinical interest.
And reading your resume, all the reports and projects you've been involved with, it has to be a passion, not just a career for you.
It is a passion. There is nothing that I want more than to see a world without suicide. That's what I go to work for every day. Some days are more exciting than others, but I absolutely love the work that I do, and being able to do things like this, to work with communities, to actually save people's lives, I think is an incredible opportunity.
Pretty easy to understand what the goal is of this project, but what are the ideas behind the concept? What makes it work?
Well, zero suicide is an idea that we should always strive to prevent suicide for every person who's at risk, that no one should be left behind. Many initiatives always aim to reduce rates by 10% or 20%. In this program, we strive to prevent all suicide. The idea that by implementing a series of interventions, by connecting people and engaging them in the right kinds of care specifically for suicide risk, we can actually drive down significantly the rate of suicide. And we did that across our program. Kudos to all of our clinical staff and leaders who, for a year and a half, actually we had zero suicides for our entire patient population in behavioral health.
Doing a little research for this, I know you said at one point that 1 in 5 people who committed suicide had a medical appointment in the week prior to it.
That's right. Our research shows that most people are right in front of their healthcare providers within weeks of when they die by suicide. Over 90% of people have a visit at some point in the year before they attempt suicide. Almost 85% have a visit before they die by suicide. and 50% within a month. So people are in front of our healthcare providers. And sometimes we're missing it, sometimes our symptoms aren't showing, but the idea is that there is an opportunity to get people connected to the type of care that could potentially save their life.
So obviously part of this has to be training for physicians, and primarily primary care physicians, I believe.
Well, right. A lot of times where people are going is often to primary care or general medical specialty settings. The trouble is that nobody knows or has known what to do before. So there's always been this idea that there's not much that they can do in primary care. There's also been a sort of a fear because nobody knows what to do if somebody says that they're feeling suicidal. So now we have some approaches that work on identification and then helping people with the next step. The other thing that's important to know is that there's actually no training for most physicians, social workers, psychologists, or any medical providers to work with people who are at risk for suicide. There's no mandatory education and education programs, and there's very few states that have continuing education requirements on suicide risk. So we're working to try and make sure all of that changes while also trying to educate physicians to help them get to the place where they know what to do.
There must be some training then that goes on within your organization to make this work.
Absolutely.
It can't just be one or two of you carrying it out.
No, absolutely, and I want to thank and call out our chair of our psychiatry department, Dr. Kathy Frank, who is just an incredible leader. She is championing this effort and has really vowed to train everybody to make sure people know what they're supposed to do. We have initiatives in primary care, we have initiatives in behavioral health, all are different initiatives with different goals, because what we can't do is provide intensive services in primary care because they're the gateway for every disease. They can't be specialty care providers, but they can be the gateway and help us provide care in specialty behavioral health.
Is this concept now pretty well ingrained in the Henry Ford Health System?
I think we're always working to improve. You know, what I would say is that I think Henry Ford is a leader in suicide prevention. We're worldwide known to be a leader in suicide prevention, but what I always say is we should never say that we've done a good enough job, because every day we're working to improve our program. What we call rapid cycle quality improvement means that we're always working. Every time new evidence comes out, we're improving our program, we're reviewing situations that didn't go well, and we're really trying to improve every day.
More questions for you in just a couple of minutes. I'll be back with more on today's show after we take this 2-minute break. Again, our guest this morning is Dr. Brian Amadani, and he's with the Henry Ford Health System. The project he's involved with is Zero Suicide. Even if we train doctors to identify these issues, these potential suicide victims, are they willing to share that information with their doctor? What's your experience there?
Well, the first thing we have to do is ask the question. You know, what we have never done is actually ask people if they're at risk for wanting to hurt themselves. And that's the first step. Many people will say yes. They don't know how to bring it up in an appointment, but if you ask them directly, then they will say yes. And there are specific screening tools that we use that are used across the country. But sometimes people do say no. And what we have to recognize is that's part of the illness. The illness itself makes it difficult for people to get care. Because remember, it's a cognitive issue that causes changes in brain functioning. So people aren't able to express sometimes the way that they're feeling. So what we also need to do is be vigilant, so that if we're noticing signs, warning signs or risk factors like people talking about not wanting to live anymore, or wanting or feeling hopeless, feeling shameful or isolating, those are all signs. And it doesn't mean that that person is at risk, but it is a good sign that they could be at risk.
What about the average person who may have a friend or a relative who is contemplating suicide.
Yeah.
What do they do? And what if they're just suspicious about it? I suppose the same thing they have to ask.
Yeah. Yeah, everybody should be willing to ask the question. You know, one of the things that we've struggled with for so long is that people don't know what to do. They don't know how to ask, and they're fearful that if they do ask, it may bring that idea into somebody's mind. But that's actually not the case. It's really important to be willing to ask and to reach out. And even if somebody says no, that sometimes if the symptoms are there, isolation, you know, making other comments about not wanting to live, or having really serious health conditions or mental health conditions, sometimes we still want to have somebody go in and just get an evaluation or a checkup real quick.
Are we finding, are certain people more prone to this than others? Are there psychological factors within us?
Well, a lot of times it could be genetic. Sometimes people are genetically at increased risk for suicide, but a lot of times it's also exposure to an environmental situation, like a traumatic event that somebody goes through, terrible experience, or a job loss, or a painful death, or some other abusive situation that may increase someone's risk for suicide. And you know, it's important to recognize that those experiences actually change the chemistry in people's brains. It changes the functioning and cognitive ability, so that what we think is, well, just stop thinking that.
Right.
You know, the idea is, well, just stop feeling that way.
It's kind of like depression too, isn't it?
It is kind of like depression.
Right.
What we've always thought is that suicide is really a symptom of depression, but it's not. It's actually its own condition. And we really need to treat it that way. If we treat depression and hope the suicide risk goes away, that's sort of like prescribing exercise and healthy eating for somebody who just had a heart attack, assuming that it was because they were overweight. But it could be a whole bunch of different things that led to somebody having a heart attack. And what we need to do is also treat the actual suicide risk.
What can you do for people who are contemplating suicide? What kind of treatments are available?
For the first time ever, we now have some treatments that have shown by themselves to be evidence-based to reduce suicide. We've never had that before. And suicide, unlike many health conditions, where we've seen treatments available for hundreds of years, for most of that time, we just thought that suicide was inevitable, or that we needed to treat another condition and assume that suicide risk would go away. If we treated depression or if we treated substance use, then that suicide risk would go away. We know that's not the case now. We want to treat depression, but we should also treat the suicide risk at the same time. And now there are evidence-based approaches. So for instance, there are screening tools that allow us to screen people to ask people the question. They don't always say yes because of their cognitive ability when they're sick, but when people do say yes, they are at significant risk for a suicide suicide attempt over the next 90 days, 1 year, 2 years out in the future. We have short, brief interventions that help people for what to do in the moment that they're feeling suicidal. So safety plan. There are outreach, caring contact interventions where we stay in communication with people in between healthcare appointments, and then there are intensive therapy based treatments that are available for people now that have shown to reduce suicide among people who are getting that kind of care.
Okay. We have to take one more break. We'll be back with more on today's show after we take this 2-minute break. Again, we're talking with Dr. Brian Amandani. It's been said that suicide is probably among the most preventable causes of death in this country. Are we making progress?
Well, the numbers would say that we're not making progress. But the movement, the attention, the energy would tell me that in a few years we'll see progress.
Okay. What about here in the Upper Peninsula? What can we be doing? What should our community be doing if we're concerned? And obviously many people are.
Well, one of the great things that's going on right now is there are advocacy groups, community groups that are working diligently on this issue. They've been working on it. The trouble is that until the last 10 years or so, we haven't really had any real interventions, real treatments that work for people. And now we do. And we also have some energy and support from healthcare systems and community groups, community treatment centers to work on this issue. So now we have this great synergy between availability of treatments and commitment of resources and energy and enthusiasm to work on a problem. And we always need that circumstance to be able to make real good progress. So I commend people from across the region. If people are interested, I encourage them to work and reach out with their local advocacy groups and community organizations to push on this issue. It's a very important issue, not only across the country, but specifically right here in the Upper Peninsula.
You know, there was a time when mental health was something we didn't want to talk about even. You know, any kind of mental health. People just didn't want to admit to that. And it's probably true in spades when it comes to suicide. But what I'm hearing you say, which I think is really important, is that person who's feeling that way shouldn't feel that way, that they're actually experiencing a mental sickness and that can be cured, and it's not to be ashamed of, it's to be dealt with, like cancer or heart disease or anything else.
That's right. We need to treat suicide just like every other condition that we treat all the time. People are at risk, and for a long time, people have always, and they still do, feel like, well, I shouldn't say that I'm having thoughts of suicide. That's shameful. I should be strong. I should just stop thinking this way. The reality is that it's an illness, and we have a treatment for the illness, but we just have to get people into that treatment. So we need not only community members and society to recognize that this really isn't a stigmatizing issue. This is more than just, hey, stop feeling that way.
Right.
It's caused by environmental issues, by exposures to bad events. It's also caused by other things like health conditions such as pain, chronic pain, or even a concussion or traumatic brain injury, where we actually alter the way that people are thinking, and they're stuck in an illness.
Okay. We have less than a minute left. Is there anything you wanted to say that we haven't talked about?
Well, I just want to say that we are, and the healthcare systems and community organizations here up north in the Upper Peninsula are working on this issue. And I commend the people for their motivation, their enthusiasm, and their really strong work. You know, someone should not have to die by suicide. People should not have to die, isolated, alone, or even in a place where they want to attempt to feel that way. The treatments that we have now available, the interventions, they can work for a lot of people. And I really, if people are out there and they're having thoughts of suicide, I want to encourage them to reach out for help. There are treatments available. There's even crisis lines that know how to respond and work with people without sending, people into traumatic experiences. 1-800-273-TALK is a great opportunity for people to reach out.
It's clearly a very important story, and thanks for coming in and sharing it with us this morning.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'll be back with some other thoughts for you in just a couple of minutes. Well, our discussion today was about a subject that's very personal for everyone, and I hope that each of us takes away from this conversation the message that there are things that can be done to reduce these tragic deaths. Suicide is devastating for those who choose to take their own lives and for all of those they leave behind. It's good to know there are people committed to a goal of achieving zero suicide deaths. That's a goal we can all support. On another subject, as we said at the top of the show, today is Mother's Day, a day when all mothers should be honored for the important role they play in our families and in our society. And while we honor and respect all moms, we should remember that, like the rest of us, they're not perfect. They too can make an occasional mistake. Let's consider some things that mothers may have said to their children as they were growing up, and in particular what mothers may have said to people we know. For example, do you think Carl Bonak's mom ever said, Carl, will you stop playing with that thermometer? You'll never get a job if all you care about is the weather. Or perhaps Donald Trump's mom said, do you think his mom might have said to him, oh, Donald, you have such lovely hair. Someday you could grow up to be president. How about Stan Lee, the creative genius behind Marvel Comics and the movies they would eventually spawn? Did she say, hey, Stan, or perhaps his mother would have said, Stanley, why are you always wearing a cape? You have to stop with this superhero nonsense or you'll never get a real job. Can you imagine Aaron Rodgers' mom ever saying, Aaron, will you stop throwing that football around? You're going to break something. Can't you find something better to do with your time? And did Michael Jordan's mom ever say, no, you can't have another pair of sneakers. All you do is wear them out playing basketball all the time. And how about the crooner Frank Sinatra? Might his mom have said, Frank, stop the singing. You're always singing. I just need some peace and quiet. And then, of course, there's our own Steve Asplund. I think his mom once said, Stephen, if you're going to read the newspaper, read it to yourself. We don't all want to hear it. We don't know that these things really happened. In fact, they probably didn't, because we all know that moms are really an inspiration, and that's why we honor them today. Happy Mother's Day. I'll be back in a minute. Time for us to wrap it up for another week so we can make way for the Today Show. Remember to keep UpperMichiganSource.com in mind for the latest news anytime and for a rebroadcast of this show each week. Today's show will be available starting tomorrow afternoon. Really appreciate the opportunity we had today to talk with Dr. Brian Amadani. It's great that he is here to tell this story about zero suicide, not just on our show, but at several presentations in Marquette. It's such an important story to hear. I'm glad you could join us this morning. And once again, happy Mother's Day. Hope you'll be with us again next Sunday morning.